Greetings and welcome back to another episode of Afterbirth modding tutorials, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to add familiars to the game. This is something that I've been trying to do for the longest time, but for some reason my code just didn't seem to want to work. So what I did like a few days ago is I downloaded two mods, the Marshmallow mod and the Angry Fly mod, and I tried to figure out why exactly those mods work and why mine don't. So what I did is basically copy-pasted bits and pieces, try to figure out what exactly went wrong, and I found some very strange irregularities that you kind of have to watch out for if you want to make your own familiar, and I'm here to share that information with you. So let's get started. The first thing that's important in our mod folder is the content folder, and in here we find two XML files, the items.xml and entities2.xml. The items.xml is which item we pick up and how our item looks like in the game. This is basically the same as anything that we've done before. And the second one is entities2.xml, and that is basically how our familiar entity will look like in the game when we pick our item up. So the items.xml, you can see that it's pretty much the same as all of the other items. The only difference is that instead of this tag being active or passive, it's now familiar, which is something like a meta tag, I guess, something in between, to indicate that this is indeed a familiar. The second thing that's important is that whenever we pick up a familiar or add familiars, we have to initiate it through a cache update. This is very similar to something that we did with damage ups or just stat changers overall, and in this case you have to do it as well with familiars. And the value for the cache update for familiars is just familiars, and this is what you have to put in. The rest of the attributes are actually the same and they don't make any difference. In this case I'm using Brother Bobby just as an example, and I took it from the resources folder in the main game, and you can get those resource files after you use the unpacker that comes along with Afterbirth Plus. And once you have your items.xml set up and you have every name and the sprite sheet and things like that, you can go to entities2.xml. And when you open that up, you can see that this is quite a much longer XML file. And it has a few things that you kind of have to watch out for. The first thing is the ANM2 path. And this is basically the path to the animation file, or what the name of our animation file is, so the game knows that this is how our particular familiar will look like. The second thing that's important is the name, and the name in this case is just brother, and what you really have to watch out for is that it doesn't contain a space. For some reason, if your name contains a space anywhere, so it's maybe a name made out of two words, you have to put them together, because otherwise it doesn't seem to want to work for whatever reason. And the third thing that's important is variant, and what's really important about variant is that it has to be unique. And I'm not really sure if you can omit this attribute and just delete it, and if the game knows how to automatically assign a variant. Maybe it does. I really haven't tested it out, but it's probably worth it if you want to have multiple mods and not have them clash with each other. But what's important is that every familiar has its own variant. So now there, I think, are 120 familiars in the game, and at this point each of them has their own variant ID. In this case you would have to name something that's above 120. I just chose a random number, 822. The rest of the attributes are quite self-explanatory in my opinion, and what you can kind of play around with HP, the collision damage that they do, the collision mass, the collision radius and things like that, just to see how those attributes actually affect the familiar that you spawn in. And once you kind of have that set up, we can go in our resources folder just to showcase how that looks like. So in this case, the ANM2 root is the GFX folder, and in this case I just have my brother.anm2 file, and then the according sprite sheet is found in the familiar file, and this is basically just copying the resources that exist within the game, and when you make your own animation file, you'll define there where your sprite sheet is located. The second thing, of course, is the items, collectibles, and then the sprite for our actual item. In this case, it's just the Brother Bobby sprite. When we pick this item up or on the pedestal, this is the sprite that's going to show up. Now that we've done this and basically set up the XML and the items.xml, you can find both of these files in the description as well as the main.lua code, so you don't have to type it out from the video, you can just copy it off there. So once we've done that, let's go in our main.lua code, where I think the most interesting part lies. So let's deconstruct the code now. The first line here, of course, is just registering the mod. The second line is fetching the item ID from the items.xml. And the third one is fetching the variant. This is a new thing. So what we do, we say isaac.get entity variant by name brother. And what we do is go in entities2.xml, we find the name brother, and then give back that particular variant. In this case, it's 822. And that variant refers to our familiar, which means that every time a familiar update happens, we say only call this function when this particular variant of the familiar, which is our familiar, and whenever an update happens, only call this function for this particular variant, which means that we won't be calling an update for every single familiar, but only for our particular one. And you can see that we have a few functions here, but what's important here are the callbacks. The first thing you notice is that the functions aren't tied to the mod anymore. So if you write mod colon and then the function, for some reason it doesn't work. And I have my own theories as to why that doesn't work, and they're quite complex in my opinion, and this is all how the game actually treats this particular Lua files, and I think it has to do with scope. Well, that's important if you're adding familiars and using these functions, the MC familiar init and MC familiar update, you have to name your functions like this. They have to be this way. You can't do them like we did them previously because for some reason that doesn't work. So you have to say local function and then just name of the function, and when you actually add them to the callback, you won't say mod.onEvaluateCache or mod.onInit, you would say just onInit or onFamiliarUpdate. This evaluate cache, I believe, could be mod colon onEvaluateCache and then in here mod.onEvaluateCache. But I didn't want to test it, I just left anything as it is with local function and then the name of the function without actually applying that particular function to our mod class or our mod object, depending how you look at it. So this is the first thing you have to notice here, which is very important because I've been struggling with this and trying to figure out why my way of writing code didn't work, but apparently it has to be this way if you want your familiar to spawn in the game and then actually do things. Okay, but now that we've done that and I've kind of got that out of the way, the first thing that we do is just set the particular callbacks to the particular functions. In this case, every time an evaluate cache happens, we will call the onEvaluate cache, and this is every time we pick up an item, cache update happens because we set the flags in there to familiars. Then what we do is check if the cache flag is cache familiars, and if we have that particular item, and then we will spawn our familiar in that position. To spawn our familiar, first of all, we have to say entity type entity familiar, then it's our particular variant of the familiar, which is 822, then it's a subtype. In this case, this 0 refers to the same subtype as this case, and there actually is a function to get a subtype, but for the time being I just set it as 0 because I don't intend on making multiple variants or maybe multiple familiars that look the same but just maybe have a slightly different way of working. So for that reason I just set a subtype as 0. I spawn it at my player's position with 0, 0 velocity, and the entity who spawns it is player. I save it in a local variable e because this is the entity that spawns, but I don't really do anything with it at this time, but you obviously could if you wanted to. And then the other two functions which we haven't met before are the mcFamiliar initialization and mcFamiliar update. And the init function, in this case, we just tie it to the variant, which means that only when our particular variant of a familiar is initialized, we will be calling the function called onInit. In this case, I don't do anything with it. But what you could do is maybe set the orbit speed, maybe you could set up some original parameters, basically anything that needs to be set once, maybe something like damage, speed, some behavior, maybe the starting position, things like that. Basically anything that's only set once, you would do it in this function because this function is only called once your familiar is initialized. The third function is mcFamiliar update, and we tie it to the onFamiliar update, and again we only call this function when our particular variant of the familiar gets an update. And in this case, this is this function. And what this function does is, one thing you have to notice is that all of these functions, the onInit and the onFamiliar update functions, get the fam, or basically, I know that's a very unfortunate name, but basically this variable, you can name it anything you want. I just named it fam, which is familiar for short, and what you get here is basically a familiar entity which you can then manipulate. In this case, of course, what I did is I just set fam follow position to the player position, which means every update I'm just saying follow that particular position, and then what this familiar will do is just follow our player's position. And what I did, just as an added bonus, I just set the frame count, and if it's divisible by 30, I get a random degree between 0 or 1 and 360, and then I just fire a tear in that particular direction. So basically what this does is just it'll follow us and they just random fire tears in random directions, and this is what our familiar does. It looks like Brother Bobby when we spawn it. Every half a second, if your frame rate is 60, it's gonna shoot a random familiar in one direction. And it was quite long-winded, and I know maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense, but again, like with any other tutorial, this is just a template which you can expand on. If you want to make an orbital that just orbits you, you can do that. There's some math involved which require you to kind of calculate the position of that particular entity as they orbit around you, but what's more important is that this fam attribute or parameter or variable, however you want to call it, is from the entity familiar class, and you have some nifty functions there and attributes which you can access. And if I just open up the documentation, you can see that the entity familiar class reference there's a bunch of functions you can use in this case. They get orbit position, follow parent in this case, fire projectile, and then in which direction you want to fire, play charge animation, play float animation, etc. Then you can access some other attributes as well, in which direction it's moving, the speed of the orbiting, the state, things like that. Basically all of these attributes which you really can't access with any other entity, but because this is a familiar and when you actually receive it as a parameter, this is also a familiar entity, then you can apply those functions to that particular variable or object or whatever you want to refer it as. So now that we've gone through all of that, and it was actually quite a struggle, let's jump into the game and I'll show you how our familiar works. Welcome to the game, and first of all we have to give ourselves our new familiar to see how it works. And in this case you can see that we spawn a new Brother Bobby, or at least he looks like Brother Bobby, and he just shoots random tears in some direction. He also has some very little contact damage, so he's useful in that regard, but essentially what this familiar does is just he's a familiar, and he's properly a familiar in the game. He's initialized as a familiar, and then of course we can access the entity familiar class and attributes. What's really important to kind of take away from this is that, of course, now he doesn't play any animations, but you can combine the things we learned from the how to animate file to actually animate your familiar. So what you can do is change its state depending on, like the Marshmallow mod, if it goes over a fire, and maybe you could set your familiar on fire, you can add animation for your Brother Bobby burning. As soon as you move around, what you could also do is that the familiar changes direction with you, and these are also things that you can animate in the animation editor and then just play them in the particular code that you're going to be executing. But overall, you know, this is how to make a familiar, this is how to add a familiar properly into the game, and how to add contact damage, how to make it shoot or do whatever you want with it. And of course, at this point, once you have that unfamiliar update function, in there you can put anything that your heart desires, and you can make all kinds of familiars that bounce around, shoot, orbit you, or maybe do other wacky things like collect coins for you. So we've come at the end of this video as well, and my voice isn't fully there, and maybe it's noticeable throughout the video because I've been struggling to say some words, so sorry if some things weren't very clear, but of course, like always, I urge you to ask questions or join our Discord chat because there is a bunch of happy individuals who are very willing to help, and I think at this point, when making familiars, we can make some really cool things happen, and I hope that this tutorial has helped you out to do so. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.